Ehud Olmert becomes the latest in a line of high-ranking Israeli officials to face questioning over corruption. Why have so many scandals plagued Israeli politics? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert was questioned by police for more than 5 hours over his alleged abuse of influence in the privatisation of Bank Leumi 2 years ago. He's suspected of manipulating the privatisation process in favour of an Australian businessman. But this case is just one of several recent corruption scandals in Israeli politics. Ayman Mohyeddin has more on the Olmert case and others.
In Israeli society, it's a list of who's who. Not politicians vying for political office, but politicians facing one corruption scandal after the other. In recent years, Israel's leadership has been plagued with scandals that have rocked the ruling establishment. Among those being investigated for a litany of crimes are Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who's being investigated for the purchase of a home below market value and the privatization of an Israeli bank in 2005. Israel's former president, Moshe Katsav, recently struck a plea bargain to avoid rape charges, but will still face charges on lesser sexual offenses. There's also former finance minister Avraham Herson, who was indicted on suspicion of fraud, theft, and other crimes. And former prime ministers such as Ehud Barak, Ariel Sharon, and Benjamin Netanyahu have all been under suspicion at one point or the other. Some blame Israel's corruption woes on its proportional representation system. Others blame the country for emphasizing security above accountability and its ongoing occupation of Palestinian lands. Now, despite an increased sense of frustration among the Israeli public and calls for his resignation, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has maintained his innocence and has vowed to fight any charges that could still yet grow.
Well, joining our discussion today are guests in Jerusalem, Gil Hoffman, the chief political correspondent and analyst for the Jerusalem Post, and Michael Partam, an advocate and vice chairman of the Movement for Quality Government in Israel. Mr. Partam, why does it seem that so many of Israel's politicians are not able to keep their hands clean?
Well, it's an age-old problem, not just Israel-specific. You know, power corrupts, and the tendency of people who are certainly not angels, once they obtain power, is to abuse it. So it's important in a democracy that we constantly act to hold our elected officials to account. Really, nobody is above suspicion, as we are not governed by angels, but by human beings, very human beings.
Mr. Hoffman, do you think that's what it is? Power corrupts?
Oh, there's three different ways of looking at this. Either you can say that the politicians today are more corrupt than politicians that we had in the past, or you can say that there's more scrutiny by the press than we had in the past, or you can say that Israeli standards for what they would tolerate regarding corruption has risen. And I think that all three of those answers are absolutely right.
But how do you define what you tolerate as corruption?
Well, Israelis are not willing to allow their politicians to get away with anything anymore. You know, I don't think a society...
Politicians have always got away with it. We haven't seen anything go to trial.
No, there have been trials, and there have been politicians that have been sent to jail, and there have been politicians that have gotten off. We have a democracy and a very strong legal system in this country, and I think that the laws are enforced in the country very well.
Mr. Partam, can a country be on a war footing without a certain amount of corruption?
Well, I'm not sure that it's quite connected with the war footing, although it's certainly the case that there are instances where officials will try to use that as an excuse. I think when you're dealing with the budgets and the what's at stake in terms of monetary issues and power issues, I think that's the opening, that's the weakness of any system. And in fact, there's one other factor which I think needs to be noted, is that as opposed to 30, 40, 50 years ago, where I don't want to idealize things, but certainly we were living in a much less materialistic society. Today, society faces a tremendous emphasis on material success. And it's really unfortunate and disturbing that many of our elected officials enter politics with relatively few assets, but seem to exit politics having amassed a certain, at least a small fortune. And that's a disturbing trend that I think is not only occurring in Israel, but in capitalist market democracies. Once again, public service, as we view it, is a burden. Public service is a public trust. And while our elected officials should not go to the poorhouse, it's certainly not an opportunity for them for self-enrichment. It's an opportunity for them to serve the public. And that is what our organization is emphasizing. And I think, as was pointed out, with a certain degree of success, I think the public is less tolerant. And I'm hoping that these cases will proceed swiftly. The public will, in fact, get a full report about what was done by public officials. And I think, unfortunately, we may be in for more scandals before the situation gets better. But I believe, and we're optimistic, that if citizens act and the press acts, then we can actually bring about an improvement.
Okay, you say the public is less tolerant, but Mr. Hoffman, if the public is indeed less tolerant, why do they keep voting these politicians in?
When people go to vote in Israel, they realize that the history of the State of Israel is being written as we speak, and because of that, they vote on diplomatic and security issues. They don't vote on legal issues at all. And so because of that, people vote for who they think will protect the country the best and bring the country closer to peace, regardless of how clean their hands are. And I think that's going to continue to be the case in the future.
Do you think that's why we haven't seen trial on issues like electoral fraud and the political violence?
Look, those issues come up all the time, and we're aware of it. But the matter is really under control. You know, a country that's corrupt is not a country where laws aren't broken. Laws are broken in every country. A country that's corrupt is a country where laws aren't enforced. And I think that what we're seeing with these corruption scandals in Israel is that in Israel, laws are being enforced. Politicians that break the law will get in trouble for it. Their career will go down the drain, as has happened with many politicians recently. And we really aren't accepting politicians being corrupt anymore.
Okay, well, Transparency International is a non-partisan organization against corruption. Every year it ranks countries based on the perception of corruption there. Now, the higher the ranking, the lower the rate of corruption in the country. Although Israel is at the top of the list when it comes to the Middle East, the 2007 rankings put it at number 30 out of 180 countries worldwide. That's down 12 places from just 5 years ago and behind countries such as Canada, Chile and New Zealand. Mr. Parham, what does this do for the reputation of the country?
Well, the Transparency International Index is an invaluable tool that raises perception. And I think there's no doubt that Israelis, as has been pointed out, have a perception that corruption in this country has increased. By the way, the 2007, we actually improved 4 places. I think it's negligible from 34 to 30. It's still a very bad position to be in. But it's an important tool, and I would like to point out, if we're talking about systemic issues, and I think you rightly emphasize the fact that the electorate somehow does not translate its frustration with corruption at the polling place, and I think we do have a problem in doing that. Most of our officials are elected on a party platform and not individually, and I think if we had more individual elections, that would help translate that frustration more immediate into change in leadership or change of officials who have abused the public trust. But there's another aspect of the system which is sometimes overlooked, and that is, as was pointed out, we have a very heavy emphasis on on the legal branch of government. The Supreme Court in this country is extremely powerful on a relative basis, and I think many people and certainly we've taken advantage of that, have come to see the legal system as a way of dealing with corrupt officials, which in fact it is. And the investigations and the trials and the Supreme Court decisions indicate that the legal system will stand firm against the abuse
excuse me, interrupting. We're going to talk a little bit more of that after the break, but I just want to establish further what this is doing for the working practices of Ehud Olmert for a start. I mean, where does this leave his reputation in the country and also outside the country? And that to you, Mr. Hoffman.
Well, believe it or not, I don't think it's affecting him very much at all. He knows that the legal system in this country works very slowly. The police take their time. And because of that, he is not worried that any of these scandals can bring him down while he's in office, maybe later on. And so that gives him plenty of time to do what he wants to do to bring Israel closer to peace. He's working full-time on the summit that's coming up next month that will hopefully bring Israel and the Palestinians closer to peace. And I don't think these legal issues are really getting in the way very much at all.
Okay, for example, Zippy Lively is not particularly keen on his line as far as peace talks go. I mean, could this not be used as a tool to destabilize him?
Politically, no. I mean, Ehud Olmert is a very strong political coalition right now. Unlike Ehud Barak when he went to Camp David only 7 years ago with a minority coalition without the support of his people, Ehud Olmert has a strong coalition and a political stability that a lot of politicians would have killed for. So this really won't get in the way of that. The politicians that are calling upon him to quit are opposition politicians, and it's their job. The politicians that really matter aren't saying anything.
Let's take a short break now. But when we come back, we'll talk about the failure of the Israeli judicial system to curb high-level corruption. Stay with us.